True cases.
Division of Public Police engages in a pattern and practice of using excessive force.
Real victims.
No, he's not all right. They were pounding him in the head.
Examined by two experienced investigators.
Police car shouldn't say to protect and serve, or they should be adding themselves on the bottom. It should say to protect and serve ourselves.
The missed clues.
Austin School Police acknowledging today that they should have done more to investigate.
The cover-ups.
It was a cover-up, and I think that people were looking out for their own skin.
From the extensive work by Salvatore Restrelli and Ira Robbins comes the Archangels of Justice case files. I am your host, Joe Rost, and I will be your guide on this quest to find the answers and give a voice to the victims of these tragic cases. Hello to our listeners, and thank you again for joining us, wherever you are, for the Archangels of Justice case files. This is the 5th episode in a multi-part series looking into the Sheena Morris case. Before we get started, I would like to let our listeners know that the Archangels of Justice case files were just nominated by the People's Choice Podcast Awards in the Government and Organization category, and also for the People's Choice Award. If you get a chance, we would appreciate if you cast a vote for us. Also, thank you to all the people that have reached out to us via Facebook and Twitter. The response has been overwhelming. If this is your first time listening, I recommend you listen chronologically and start at episode 1 and work from there. If you're someone that likes to listen to things out of order, then of course, feel free to keep on listening. These next 2 episodes will focus on the FDLE report submitted in the wake of the national attention Sheena's case received. I will be reading directly from the report, but stopping periodically to respond to certain statements with the help of Kelly Osborne, Sheena's mother, Dave Morris, Sheena's father, Lee Williams, reported from the Herald Tribune, and our 2 Archangels, Sal and Ira. But first, a message from our sponsors. Do you want to launch your own podcast or host your own media? Then you should be looking at Blueberry.com. That's BLUBRRY.com. With no third-party sites to log into, you remain in control by never leaving your website and having an iTunes and SoundCloud-friendly RSS feed. Get your 30-day free trial by just typing AoJ Podcast when you check out, and you could be broadcasting your very own media today. Did you know that approximately 95% of purchase decisions are made on the first pages of search engines? TotalFrontPage.com knows this, and they can do what no other digital marketing company does. Put your company name in the autocomplete box of Google and Bing, so that searchers see your business before they see any other company. Your business will appear in most, if not all, organic listings. No competitors, just you. If you'd like to know more about this groundbreaking service, you can check out their website, TotalFrontPage.com. Or for a free consultation, mention AoJ Podcast in the subject line when you email info@TotalFrontPage.com. Act today, because once these search terms are purchased, they cannot be used by any other company. Thank you again to our sponsors for supporting this podcast. And now, I give you episode 5 of the Sheena Morris case. It is October 31st, 2013, and it's been a year since the Dr. Phil show aired Sheena's episode and Joe Genoese's failed polygraph test on national television. The case was also picked up by 2020, and that episode can be viewed at ABC's website. After the national attention, the family is eagerly awaiting the results from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the State Attorney of Florida's investigation into Sheena's death. Kelly and Dave had fully cooperated with both investigations.
I can see why you would think that it was 2 separate investigations because the way the state attorney released their summary and the FDLE released theirs, it was all the same combined investigation. And I don't know of any other time when they've released something like this that the state attorney's office also releases a separate summary. In this case, they were all working together and they wrote 2 separate summaries of their findings, and they all worked together to squash everything that they could.
Both these state departments took the exact same investigative approach, but I'm mainly going to focus on the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's report, which I'll hyphenate now to FDLE. The state attorney's report was not received until November 20th, 2013. When Kelly and Dave read the FDLE report, they were completely shocked by what they read. I'm going to read from the FDLE's actual report of the Bradenton Beaches investigation and talk about it as we go through the report to let you, the listener, judge if this was a fair investigation. I will try to be as clear as possible when I'm reading from the actual report versus when I'm summarizing or giving considerations about what is said. Before I get started with the summary of the report, I would like the listener to please note that Officer Basil and Security did not file the reports of their interaction with Sheena Morris until January 3rd. It is noted much later in the FDLE's report, but is something to keep in mind because the FDLE will use this interaction to call Sheena's character into question. This is from the actual FDLE report and what the officer said happened. On January 1st, 2009, at approximately 1:23 a.m., 2 officers from the Bradenton Beach Police Department responded to a domestic disturbance at the Bridgewalk Resort and spoke with Sheena Morris, a 22-year-old female and the only occupant of room 525. Officers later note in their reports that after making contact with Sheena Morris inside the room and determining the nature of the incident, they likely observed Joe Genoese in the parking lot as they were coming up to the room. Basil and Secure reported in summary that Morris was extremely emotional upon first contact, but noted that she was rational and calm during the interview. They also report that Sheena did not appear intoxicated. Officer Basil reported that Sheena claimed she just needed someone to talk to, so she called the police. I would like to talk about this for a minute. Bradenton Beach police were not responding to Sheena's call. They were responding to the other hotel guest's 911 call. So this is just not factual. Sheena called the Manatee County Sheriff's after the police left. We also looked through the report the officers filed to figure out how someone goes from extremely emotional to rational and calm in 15 minutes. But nothing is noted in their report. Sal talks about Basil and Security's report in the FDLE's investigation.
Yeah, but they didn't bother calling out to other units or one of them jump in their car to try to track him down. They didn't bother. And that's what's the sad part about this. Their own reports basically say they ignored crime. They ignored the crime of domestic battery. They have ignored the crime of a possibility of a DUI. They just didn't bother investigating at all. It just goes to show you what they did in Sheena's death investigation. They didn't investigate that either. They investigated, what they did was they documented a suicide.
Getting back to the FDLE report, this is what Officers Basil and Security stated. The officers reported that Sheena showed both officers the mark on her neck, but would not definitively explain its cause. They reported that Morris claimed Genoese was, quote, flinging his arms around during an argument, and that his watch may have hit her. Okay, wait, that's a contradiction. So Sheena did explain how she got the marks on her to the officers, and that Genoese caused them. Back to the FDLE report. Morris reported the details of the argument and stated that it involved a disagreement about going back out for a drink and money that Genoese took out of her purse before leaving. Sheena advised that $100 of the money had been taken had belonged to her, and it was a gift from her father. Sheena declined the officer's offer to call her family to the resort to pick her up. According to the Bradenton Beach Police, Sheena did not report a domestic violence and did not complete an affidavit with respect to the incident. Okay, so the FDLE does not mention that the officers do not need Sheena to fill out an affidavit to make an arrest in this case, whether it was Sheena or Genoese. They also make no note of the fact that Sheena twice states on her 911 call that she did indeed fill out a police report. I asked Sal how none of this can be mentioned in the FDLE's report.
They want to gloss over it. Once again, if they document that happened, that leaves a whole wide avenue again. Wait a minute. She called the police, said she filled out a police report, but the police are saying she didn't. They don't need her to do it. But the fact of the matter is they're saying she didn't do it. But she said in her 911 call that she filled out a report. Sheena wouldn't know
twice.
An affidavit or a report. All she knows is I filled out a police report. She don't know if it's an affidavit or what it is. She's not geared on these legal terms, but she said it. And it's on tape recording, memorialized forever. She said it. She said he took my purse, my keys, my money. But they don't mention any of that. They don't mention the fact that the purse is back in the room again either. So you make begs over and over and over again. I know 10 and 12-year-old kids that have more brains and more gumption than FDLE did and Art Brown did put together.
According to the FDLE, the officers only see the mark on Sheena's neck, but no other injuries, and see, quote, no signs of violence in the room.
Blood, there was no gunshots, so there's no violence. But if you look at the crime scene photographs, the bed is kind of askew, the pillows here and there, things like that nature. She's got scratches on her body. That indicates violence to me. If I was a police officer working that scene and I walked up on a domestic and I saw a woman that had scratches on her neck and her face and her hands, I'd say, gee, what happened? And if she gave me some sob story, I'd say, look, It looks to me like he beat you up a little bit and go find this guy. And then I would take his ass to jail. It'd be that simple. But they didn't choose to do that. They chose to walk out of that room that night because obviously Sheena was not so depressed or so drunk or so suicidal. Because if she was in that condition and they left her there, they're derelict in their duty even 10 times worse. And they shouldn't even have badges. They should be in jail.
The officers also reported these statements were made by Sheena: that her father had given her a signed $100 bill for Christmas with a promise to double it if she still had it the next time they saw each other, that she was a trust fund baby and owned her own house in Tampa. She received one of the dogs as a gift when she was hospitalized regarding a seizure. Her mother had given it to her. Also, that her father lived 3,000 miles away and she had not spoken with her mother in 10 years. Again, please remember the officers did not fill out a report until 3 days later, and only one of these statements is remotely true: the story about the $100 bill. The FDLE also fails to mention that the officers reported seeing open beer cans in the room, but beer was never found, or that Sheena had told them Genoese was drinking and driving. Back to the FDLE report. The Bradenton Beach police officers, Basil and Securi, cleared the call via dispatch and changed the call classification from domestic to disturbance. Bradenton Beach police records indicate that the officers completed their call at 1:50 a.m. The FDLE gives no explanation as to why the officers changed the classification or why the officers filed their report 3 days after the fact. I asked Sal why this was not noted in the report.
It's a creative writing. I have. That's all I can say about it. I have to. I'll mention this in a deposition I was in not that long ago, where this attorney brought up the fact that I've written a few fiction novels, and he tried to say that my expert report was basically fiction. And I had a chuckle. I said, no. I said, actually, the report is exactly the facts of what happened and didn't happen in your case. It's your police officers' reports that are fiction. Fact of the matter is, when Ira and I write reports and affidavits, we rely strictly on fact and fact only. We don't write affidavits and reports that are suppositions. We may render an opinion about something, but we support it with facts. These police officers had no facts whatsoever because we know everything they wrote in that report was a lie. Sheena and her mother are close. Her dad loves her. He's close to her. She could have had them call her mother. She could have called her mother herself. If she wanted to, she had a phone. Maybe she decided she was going to spend the night and then go home in the morning. It was late. She didn't want to bother her mother. She did call 911 to discuss her apartment. Someone that's going to be lucid enough to do that, to have the police check on her apartment, probably decided, I don't want to disturb my mother on New Year's Eve. I'll just call her tomorrow.
This is a story Lee Williams told me about Officer Basil and what he found when he was writing his articles.
Basil went to a rape crisis center on duty, and at some point walks across the room and kisses a counselor in a rape crisis center. I mean, this whole police department out there, when we were doing this investigation, we were referring to it as the island of broken toys. I mean, all of their officers have issues with their past.
So that was the character of one of the men who spoke with Sheena that night, Officer Mike Basil. And from what the FDLE reported, we can only come to one of two conclusions. Either both officers were so incompetent they were unable to see a girl depressed enough that she was going to take her life just a few hours later, or they were both lazy and didn't want to file a police report on New Year's Day. Sal talks about how the FDLE's report makes Officer Basil and Securi look as police officers.
You have to sit there and say to yourself once again, these clowns, they go there, they don't do their job, like I mentioned before. They should have stopped this guy in the parking lot when they saw him. They didn't know who he was. They should have said, hey, come here, I want to talk to you for a minute. Find out who he is. Find out if he's part of this domestic, then hold him there. Do what you have to do as a police officer. Investigate. Don't just fluff stuff off. The fact that they didn't write a report the night after that incident doesn't surprise Ira and I, because when they left, they changed the call from a domestic to a disturbance. And as Ira and I have discussed before, a disturbance doesn't require a report. But now 3 days later, after she's found dead, and the chief is going, oh man, we got to do something about this domestic you guys had. Somebody's got to write a report. So they come up with their little report. Again, creative writing. FDLE, who's supposed to be the state's shining star of law enforcement, FDLE, they don't say a word about it. Going, 3 days later, but wait a minute, your report, you on the radio said you guys changed this to a disturbance. So it was just a disturbance that night or domestic? Which one was it? There's no questions about what these people do. They just do what they want to do.
Back to the FDLE's investigation. At approximately 2:19 p.m., Officer Gill and Higgins arrive at the bridge walk, and when they enter the room, they see Sheena hanging in the shower. Emergency Medical Services responds and pronounced Sheena deceased at 2:46 p.m. Bradenton Beach Police requested Manatee County's crime scene unit and a medical examiner from District 12 to process the scene. Bradenton Beach Police Detective Leonard Diaz responded as well. Quick note, because this is a little misleading, as Detective Diaz was the one that called the crime scene unit and the medical examiner. This report makes it sound like they responded at the same time. There is also no explanation made about the 3 hours it took Bradenton Beach Police to make that call or the times the parties reported. Inexplicably, though, there is no mention that Detective Diaz accidentally called Kelly from Sheena's phone that day, but was unable to find out that Sheena called 911 from that same phone. Bradenton Beach Police interview the occupants of the adjoining rooms, 524 and 525. I will play their testimony for you now, but please note these statements were taken nearly 4 years after Sheena's death, and there's no official statement from the hotel guest from that day. Also, I'm not going to mention their names, as they have been asked enough about this one night. According to room 526, they heard this.
As far as I can remember, almost 5 years ago.
Right, of course.
And being New Year's Eve.
And then this is what FDLE took down. On the 31st, Ms. Frith said they were tired and in the room before midnight. The first she heard from the Morris room was when the door slammed. Frith said the female voice was mad or angry and yelled something to the effect of, "Did you see what you did to my body?" The couple was in the room at that point and was clearly arguing about money. The male answered in an unemotional, detached voice, and Frith could not hear him well. She recalled that the male stated, "I want my money back, bitch," in a voice devoid of emotions. The female replied that she didn't have the money as she lost it on the beach. So far, does that sound accurate?
Yeah, as far as I can recall.
Okay. Frith was concerned and directed McClanathan to call the police. He did. A few minutes after the call, Frith heard the door slam and it was quiet. Just minutes after that, she heard two male voices that she assumed to be police officers. The female voice changed and sounded to Frith like that of a hurt little girl. She described the male as her fiancé with whom she had had a fight. A male voice said that they had probably walked past her fiancé in the parking lot. One of the male voices questioned her, asking her if she was staying with her fiancé, where was his luggage? As the female spoke with the men, Frith said her voice was calm and composed. Has that part sound accurate?
That sounds accurate.
Okay. Frith said she went to bed and drifted in and out of sleep. Somewhere between 2:30 and 3:30 hours, she heard the sliding glass door in the Morris room close that led to a second floor outside balcony. The next thing Frith heard was the alarm in that room going off. She guessed that it to be between 6 and 7 a.m. The alarm sounded continuously for so long that Frith got up, showered, and left the room. She is not sure if and when the alarm ceased. In response to questions, Frith said she heard no more voices or dogs barking in that room. She didn't hear the front door or rear slider either. She never saw either the male or female from that room. Sometime a while later, a detective hired by Kelly Osborne called her and left a card on her door. Frith did not respond.
Okay, I think we were guesstimating the time that I heard. It sounded like when I was coming in and out of sleep that there was a sliding glass door.
Okay.
Sometime in the night when I was sleeping. I just remember waking up and hearing that a little bit.
Now, give me an idea on the configuration of these rooms. The slider that you thought it was would be the slider to a balcony that would face out over, I don't know what's in the back of the
parking lot.
Parking lot, okay.
Faced out over, yeah.
Would there be any way for somebody to get into the room from outside utilizing that balcony slider? Or is it like one that just overhangs like the parking lot? You understand what I'm saying?
Sort of. I mean, from what I can remember, there was a balcony, maybe 2 stories or so above the parking lot.
Did you have one?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and that's what I'm assuming they had.
Okay.
And it sounded like a glass door sliding open.
And I have been advised that the walls of this hotel were extremely thin. Was that your your experience? Because you could hear so much of the conversation going on next door.
Fairly thin, yeah. I did hear a lot.
And as you said in your statement, there seemed to be a distinction in terms of emotional tone between the female and the male, and that the female was angry and the man was sort of unemotional, detached.
With the slamming of the door, it seemed to me that she was very incensed that he would have the audacity to hurt her body.
Okay.
Did you see what you did? I mean, she was very angry. And then that's why it sounded like such a contrast when she was talking to the police. She just seemed like she was a really hurt, fight with her fiance. She was, very hurt. Sound very different than the anger tone.
Could you, during the time they were arguing, I take it you could hear her voice and her words fairly clearly?
It seems so.
And his voice, I understand it was lower in tone. Could you hear what he was saying clearly, or just selected portions?
The only thing I ever heard him say
was, "I want my money back, bitch"?
Yeah,
Okay.
but in a very monotone, seemed like no emotion. I mean, it was shocking to me in a way, because I'm thinking, she's so angry. And he's just like, "Oh, I want my money back, bitch." And I'm like, it just didn't seem appropriate for her being so angry that he was so monotone.
Now, in the aftermath of this, did you write down any notes or anything, or did you compile any kind of file on this?
I had some notes, and I have not been able to find them.
Okay.
I've moved twice, and I was going to try to find them when Kelly Osborne originally was contacting me, but I couldn't seem to locate them. So
Okay. And were they written down shortly after the events that you're talking about?
Yeah.
While it was fresh in your mind?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I did.
Now, I'm told that FDLE showed you. Did they show you a copy of her notes that she supposedly wrote down from your?
They did.
Okay. And I think that's what I have in front of me.
They seem quite different from what I remember discussing.
Okay. And that's what I would like you to do. Is I believe these are the notes. If you could highlight for me the portions that do not accord with your memory of the events or your memory of your conversation with Mrs. Osborne. If these are purporting to be her notes. This is what she's provided me, and law enforcement's provided me. And
I can't be sure of this because it was a conversation. This thing has been like over 5 years ago.
Understood.
So,
So just,
I wouldn't,
if you would, the ones that you are
100% on it.
The ones that you feel fairly comfortable that either, you didn't say or you think were misunderstood, if you could highlight those for me.
Okay.
I'm not holding you to this other than to get a sense of, how accurate her,
in other words,
her notes are.
Correct your statement.
Yeah.
Are these your
According
words or
to what
her
I
words?
can remember.
Yes. I mean,
Yeah,
some of it she may have been interpreting rather than actually basing it on what you actually said, and that's what I'm
Right.
trying to get a sense of.
Okay.
Are these your words or her words?
Right. I can interpret it as far as I can remember.
Sure.
But I was really surprised when the FDLE was talking to me and he said, "Did you hear dogs barking?" And, this was last year.
Yeah.
And it had been 4 years at that point. And I said, "No." And then he said, "Well, that's funny because it was with you did." And I thought, wow. And then I thought, well, maybe there were dogs barking now that he mentioned it.
But they're asking,
I didn't remember at the
are these
time.
statements correct?
Yeah, let me take a look. Okay.
And of course, I'm asking you for your recollection. and not that of Mr. McClenathan's or anybody else's, because the fact is, I've been doing this for 25 years. I'm sure you've had this experience as an attorney. Different people will focus on different aspects of an event.
I'm not sure about this one. I would think.
Why don't you use if you're saying that it's not right, or you're saying you don't remember ever having said that, if you could highlight that.
Okay, I remember wanting to confirm it was truly her.
Okay.
But I'm not sure about someone maybe trying to scare her. I wasn't. I don't know if I said that.
Okay.
She says for a moment. She asked for a moment so that she could get her files she has on this. That would have been those notes I had before.
Mm-hmm.
Explains that she kept her ear up to the door the whole time, and that she knew since she is a rape crisis counselor. I was never a rape crisis counselor.
Okay.
She knew to listen. I had worked at Safe Place Rape and Crisis Center, and I remember telling Michael to call the police. I said, because, and I did listen, I said, because this is how people wind up dead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Sheena did sound educated. She sounded like one of my daughter's friends.
Okay.
They're about the same age. And that's, I think, part of the motherhood thing that pulled me to it, as well as the crisis center experience. I don't remember what time I went to bed. Shall I strike that?
Well, if it's possible that she did report it accurately, then no, don't highlight that.
All right.
I'm just looking for things where you feel comfortable. I didn't say that, or that's not what I remember. You know, I'm trying to, you know, whatever you're comfortable with in terms of your memory.
Okay, I was awoken at midnight by the hotel door next door being slammed. Yeah, I think that's so. I was going to sleep around that time. I don't think I was awoken. I think I was just drifting, but I remember hearing that.
Okay.
Of course, I wouldn't have known it was Joe and Sheena.
Right.
But I heard a couple arguing. Yeah, she was mad as hell. Did you hear Sheena yelling, "Get your hands off my neck, get your hands off my neck"? Then she hears Sheena yell, "Look at what you did to my body. Was it worth $100?
Do you remember the comment, "Get your hands off my neck"? Do you believe that you reported that to Mrs. Osborne?
No, you know what seems to stick in my mind? And I thought when you said before what you did to my body sounded a little off key. I think the whole thing was about her neck. She was saying, or maybe she said something like, "Did you see what you did to my body? And did you see what you did? Did you see what you did to my neck?"
Okay,
so I do remember hearing the word neck, but I didn't hear him to get his hands off. I just heard, "Did you see what you did to my body?"
Neck. Okay,
my neck.
That's fine.
Okay, but not get your hands off. And she may have said something. Was that worth $100? Or did you see what you did to my neck? Fight on the beach. Yeah, I did hear that. Steve said it. Sounds like the police were treating Sheena more like a prostitute. I did. I thought she was a prostitute because I'm thinking, well, they're asking where's his belongings, and he's talking about $100. So my logic just went to, well, maybe that was the prostitution situation. I didn't say they were treating her like that, but the question made me think that. Okay.
Well, then why don't you put a highlight through treating since you're saying that's not
like a prostitute. The police questioned Sheena. Oh yeah, where's the suitcase? Yep. Suitcase belongings or his bag. I think something like that. But she explains the police left. Sheena called someone telling them what had just happened. This was her 911 call. Yeah, I did hear her talking to someone on the phone in a very kind of quiet tone, and I didn't realize it was 911. I had 3 or 4. It was quiet, probably sometime in the night. Michelle heard the door open, and the dogs barked for a moment. Oh, maybe I did. I don't remember.
You don't know if you don't know if that's if you heard that or not.
I did. Sometime in the night heard sometime during the night, I heard what sounded like a sliding glass door open.
That comment would refer to the rear slider that you've already talked about.
Yeah.
Not the front door.
Right.
Did you hear dogs barking?
I don't remember hearing the dogs barking. but it says that I did.
So there was a lot that we just heard. But the biggest thing I noticed is that all those statements that Art Brown is reading are coming from Kelly's investigation, not Detective Diaz. Kelly had to ask about that night 6 months after the fact. Why weren't those statements taken that day? Also, Officer Basil and Security's interaction, where they stated Sheena was extremely emotional, is not backed up by what that hotel guest heard. Again, none of this is followed up with Art Brown. All he merely does is ask questions to poke holes into Kelly's investigation. Why doesn't he use Detective Diaz's own report to do that? Is that because he never recorded those statements that those hotel guests made? The hotel guests in room 524 reported hearing similar things. If you'd like to listen to those interviews in their entirety, they'll be available on archangelsofjustice.org shortly after this podcast launches. Getting back to the FDLE report. Crime scene investigator Jason Smith and the medical examiner Megan Shimrack examined, photographed, and documented their observations and reported that Sheena was found hanging by the neck, partially suspended, with her feet on the ground. Sheena's back was to the shower wall, and her buttocks was approximately 6 to 8 inches off the shower floor. A blue nylon dog leash was observed tied to a pipe leading to the shower head. Sheena was wearing a hooded shirt, a t-shirt, a bra, long pants, panties, and her feet were bare. The FDLE again fails to mention a few things here. Sheena's feet were also caked in sand. They also didn't mention that investigators were photographed watching football on TV in Sheena's hotel room. I asked Sal how none of this can be in the report.
They just don't expect people like Kelly Osborne to come along and her ex-husband Dave Morris, and then a team of professionals like Jan Johnson and Jack Tremarco and Dr. Baden, who got involved in this case before we did, to go over this case and basically destroy the FDLE investigation and Bradenton Beach investigation. And then we come along after that and find even more wrong with FDLE and Bradenton Beach. But no one wants to listen. No one wants to make the changes because they think these are isolated cases. They go, oh, poor family. It's just this one girl, though. That's a shame. It can't be like that all the time. Oh, wait till you see our case files. Keep people tuned into this station and let them listen to about 60 of our case files, and they're going to want to vomit. And it'll be demanding changes because we don't have it just in Florida. It's all over this country, and we've traveled around this country and seen it.
Continuing with the FDLE report. CST Smith collected swabs of yellow stain on the shower floor near Sheena's legs and bagged her hands and feet. Sheena's body was removed from the shower and placed on a clean sheet on the bathroom floor. He photographed and processed the interior of the shower for fingerprints, collecting 6 latent cards. CST Smith noted he observed, quote, no swipes or marks consistent with Morris attempting to get up or a second person bracing themselves inside the shower. So there are a couple of things here that are not mentioned. Both Smith and Shimrack were told by Detective Diaz that they were processing a suicide. Sal talks about how this perspective can mess up a crime scene investigator's collection of evidence.
When I taught crime scene classes to students, I used to tell them all the time, if you go to a case where you've got a dead body and you act like, oh, this is a suicide because the detective told you or the deputy told you or whoever said to you, oh, he killed himself or she killed herself, and you go in there with that frame of mind, that's the way you're going to document it. You can't do that. You've got to go in there. You got a suspicious death. This thing is a homicide until the physical evidence proves otherwise. Because your detective needs to get his butt out and go question people, not hang out in the crime scene to see what I got going on. This is the difference between real crime scene investigators and some technician that they bring in that needs to be babysat. These crime scene shows on television don't do anybody any justice because they think that crime scene detectives go do whatever they do at the scene, document and all this, and then go out and go interview people. They don't do that. That's the detective's job, to get off his butt and go out knocking on doors, getting statements, getting taped ones. No, don't just talk to people and go, oh, I got a couple questions for you. Oh, you don't have to bother writing anything down. Tape it and have them write down what they said and saw. Everything. But they don't do that. If they don't want to prove a case and they want it to go away, don't tape it. Don't have them write anything down. It's just that simple, because then it's your word against theirs later on.
The FDLE also fails to comment on the fact that CST Smith never processed the shower floor for footprints, even though Sheena was barefoot. I asked Sal about the yellow stain, and shouldn't the fact that there were no marks in the shower, even from Sheena, prove that she was unconscious when she went into that shower?
Probably urine from the dog that peed on the floor in front of his dead mother, because these dogs were Sheena's children. This means Sheena referred to these dogs as her babies. That's another thing that irks me. I am a dog lover. Ira's a dog lover. I know a lot of people that are dog lovers, and they would not do anything to hurt their dogs or upset their dogs. There is no way on God's green earth that Sheena would have hung herself in the shower by, herself and allowed her dogs to run around that apartment in front of her like that. There's just no way. I don't believe that, not for 1 second. And that's probably what he collected, some yellow stain from the dogs, probably. I mean, is it possible that Sheena could have, had a bladder release? Yes, but there was no mention of that. I didn't observe any of that on her clothing. The pictures that I had seen of them. The fact of the matter is in the position she was found, she had to, if she hung herself, she would have had to support herself to lower herself to that position. There's no way she would have just dropped all of her weight, by just basically kicking her feet out in front of her and not touching the walls and hanging herself with her butt 6 inches off the floor, if that, without breaking that shower pipe. It would have never held that kind of force. She would have had to walk out slowly. And that means she would have supported herself on the wall and everything else. That means she slowly strangled herself to death. That doesn't fly. That does not fly. I've never seen a hanging like that.
The FDLE report then states everything that was found in the room, including Sheena's purse, but does not mention until later that Sheena stated on her 911 call that Genoese had taken it when he left. When they do address it, it is dismissed by them because they say Sheena was prone to exaggeration, and this was proven by the untrue statement Sheena told Officer Basil and Sakiri about her parents. These are the same officers, remember, who did not file a report until 3 days later and who have shown in the past not to follow police protocol. Next, the FDLE reports that at the request of Bradenton Beach Police, Hillsborough County sheriffs were dispatched to tell the family of Sheena's passing. Shortly thereafter, on January 1st, Detective Diaz called Kelly and she reportedly made these statements to him. Sheena had attempted suicide many years ago via overdosing on pills. She had been hospitalized as a result of the attempt. Sheena had been possibly diagnosed as bipolar and had been medicated. That Kelly and Genoese discussed Baker acting Sheena due to her anger issues. If you remember back from episode 1, Baker acting is involuntary committal for safety due to mental health reasons. Kelly told him in the past Sheena needed help. Sheena had a close relationship with her father, Dave Morris, but was mad at him after seeing him in New York. He then claims that Kelly said Sheena had mental issues due to a few of her friends committing suicide in the past. The FDLE then notes Sheena had attended a funeral of a friend the week prior. There are a couple things here that are taken out of context, but what is most striking to me is they got the date wrong. Detective Diaz did call Kelly on January 1st, but it was by accident from Sheena's phone. He did not actually talk to Kelly until January 2nd. Remember, Kelly and Sheena's family didn't even know the manner of Sheena's death until the next day. I did talk to Kelly about these supposed statements she made to Detective Diaz.
I'm going to explain how this keeps coming up over and over again. What had happened was on January 1st at around 12:30 is when Genoese calls me and tells me about their fight and what had happened that night, or at least his version of what happened. And that's where he starts discussing with me that I think Sheena's bipolar, I think she's suicidal, and this is where it all comes up, is what he is saying to me from that day. And so then when I find out my daughter's deceased, Detective Diaz and the medical examiner would both ask me. I told them what Genoese relayed to me. Not that I thought she was bipolar, not that I thought she committed suicide, but what Genoese had told me earlier that day. And then they go and misconstrue that I'm the one saying that she's bipolar and suicidal. That's how that all came about.
The FDLE investigation goes on to say shortly after speaking with Kelly, Detective Diaz spoke with Genoese via telephone. Detective Diaz reported that Genoese declined his request to respond to the Bradenton Beach Police Department to be interviewed, claiming, quote, he was too upset. Diaz reports that Genoese was, quote, very upset during the call, but was, quote, able to talk to him for a few minutes. Detective Diaz didn't interview the last person to speak with Sheena alive because he was, quote, too upset. Then, according to Detective Diaz, during that brief conversation that there is no official record of, so we do not know when Detective Diaz is recalling this information, Genoese stated that he and Sheena argued at the bridge walk earlier that morning. The argument concerned Genoese calling his children and wishing them a Happy New Year. Quick note, this is extremely vague, because Genoese said this argument happened in the hotel room, and they went to bed shortly after. But the FDLE report just says bridge walk, which does not give us a clear time of reference. But that would mean he did not call his young children until almost 1 a.m. on New Year's. Next, Diaz reports that Genoese and Sheena watched the fireworks that night, and they agreed to stay in after the argument. But Sheena later got up and wanted to go back out. They argued again, resulting in them deciding to leave the resort and go home. They packed their belongings with the intent to leave. After packing, Sheena advised she wanted to stay. Genoese told Sheena he was leaving with or without her. After Genoese left, he spoke with Sheena on the phone while he drove home. Genoese also claimed to Diaz that Sheena had been depressed lately and that she had been drinking a lot. There are a ton of things to unpack here, and statements that don't make much sense when really analyzed. But again, because there is no official report, we really don't know what was said during the conversation. But I'm going to go through it and explain the problems. Genoese has repeated multiple times that their fight was about his kids, but he clearly states here that it was about Sheena wanting to go back out. Genoese failed to mention that they also argued about money, something heard by guests in both hotel rooms. Genoese says that Sheena was depressed and had a history of drinking a lot. The problem with Genoese saying this on the first is the family did not know the manner of Sheena's death until the second, and Sheena was not drunk at the time of her death, even though there was a full bottle of vodka in the room. So either the FDLE got the dates wrong, or Genoese knew more than what he told Detective Diaz. I asked Sal about what Detective Diaz reports Genoese saying.
We don't even know if that's a factual basis. Nobody ever pulled Genoese's phone records to see phone calls to and from the police departments. There's no reports that I've seen that would actually reflect that phone call. And as I mentioned earlier, Joe Genoese, by the time Kelly found out Sheena was dead, he was at Kelly's house about that time, a few minutes later. That would have been about the time that if I was in Bradenton Beach as the police officer, I'd be saying to Hillsborough County, grab that guy, take him down to the station and hold him. I'll be there in an hour. But they didn't do that. He didn't even ask them to hold him. But when you talk to Kelly, she'll tell you that the two officers from Hillsborough that came were very helpful. And they really didn't believe Genoese's crying act that when he spilled himself out on the floor and tried to act like he was all distressed. You know, this whole thing is a dog and pony show. It's a sad mess, and it's a travesty, because in this day and age, our law enforcement in this country shouldn't behave this way. Our prosecutors shouldn't behave this way either, but they do. And it's sad.
Back to the FDLE report. On January 2nd, 2009, medical examiner Shimrack reports that Kelly made these statements during their call. Sheena was treated for an apparent drug overdose as a teen. Sheena had subsequently been diagnosed as having bipolar disorder and prescribed multiple medications. Sheena stopped taking those medications upon another doctor's recommendation. Sheena had several friends who recently committed suicide, and she attended the funeral of one of those friends the week prior. The FDLE report does not mention that this was when Kelly found out the manner of Sheena's death, but also, as will be a running theme, this report continues to focus on the supposed suicide attempt. I have Kelly and Dave set the record straight about this and everything that was said during the call with the medical examiner.
Yeah, I believe she had put I believe it was a bottle of aspirin. And supposedly she wanted, I don't know if she wanted me to think that she took a bottle of aspirin, but the aspirin were obviously thrown in the trash, and the empty bottle of aspirin was in her room. I don't remember if it was on her bed, and she had told me that she had taken the bottle of aspirin, and I had contacted Kelly because Sheena was living with me at the time, and we had brought her to the hospital and had her checked out, and I believe they even pumped her stomach and found nothing in her system.
So by their protocol, the hospital has to admit her to this other place. It was Four Winds. Four Winds, which was a hospital that was shut down. And the only way that they make their money is taking in these kids and pumping them up with medications and things, and that's what they did to Sheena. I never said that she attended a funeral. I said that she had attended because they would ask very leading questions. Their leading questions were, did she have other friends who committed suicide? And so they'd have their series of questions. So I explained she didn't attend a funeral. She actually attended a celebration of life memorial for a friend who had passed, I think, the year prior.
On that same day, January 2nd, 2009, at approximately 11:45 a.m., medical examiner Suzanne Utley conducted the autopsy on Sheena's body. You can find her whole report on the archangelsofjustice.org website under podcast. The cause of death is blacked out on the FDLE report, but the manner of death was reported as suicide, even though the next line states that prominent petechiae was seen. And as we have covered in the past episodes, this usually occurs in strangulation, not in suicides. But the FDLE glosses over this critical detail and makes no mention of it again. I asked Sal and Ira how the FDLE can just ignore that kind of hard evidence, yet continually focus on Sheena when she was 14.
That doesn't happen in hanging. A typical hanging is a very, very sudden event where the person's airway is completely shunted off. Where with a strangulation, where you're putting pressure on somebody's neck, if they're struggling, you're going to have constant pressure on and off, on and off, on and off until you subdue this person to a point where they died. Well, that causes blood pressure increases in the eyes until you see these little petechiae, what they call it. Basically, it's like look like bloodshot eyes. It's basically what it looks like. But there's certain vessels that will burst. It doesn't ring to a hanging. This is a strangulation thing, as I mentioned before. Police officers are taught how to do chokeholds. That's the bad term. It's actually called a carotid restraint, because the way it's supposed to be applied is to close off the carotid arteries on either side of the neck until the person's rendered unconscious, not by cutting off an airflow. But when you do it improperly, or you're not trained to do it properly, you can actually cut off the airway, and people have died. And they stopped doing the training for this because cops were doing it so wrong. They had too many deaths, so they stopped doing it. Now, you get a street urchin that fights with somebody, he's not going to apply a carotid restraint. He's going to choke him out. And that's, I think, is what happened with Sheena. Somehow or another, he got his hands on her again from behind and choked her out until she was unconscious, and then hung her. They keep going back and forth in their report about how the thin walls were, that they would have heard a struggle and all this other stuff. That's not entirely true. I mean, people can be subdued very, very quickly. If she was asleep when the person went in the room, he could have held her down with a pillow over her face and then got himself in a position where he could have got behind her and choked her, or even frontally. And then when she was unconscious, put the noose around her neck and finished her off, carried her in the shower.
Getting back to the FDLE investigation, which the following is read directly from. Dr. Utley reported that the date death occurred was January 1st, 2009, and the estimated time of death was between 1:50 a.m. and 2:46 p.m. The report was provided to the Bradenton Beach Police Department on January 27, 2009. The revised autopsy report was submitted by Dr. Utley on April 20th, 2011. The cause of death was reported, and it's blanked out here, and the manner of death was reported as undetermined. On January 3rd, 2009, officers Tisciri and Basil filed their reports of the response to room 525 at the Bridgewalk Resort and the interview of Morse. Now, 4 pages after the FDLE report talked about the responding officers, and buried at the very bottom of page 8, they mention when the officers filed their report. But there's no reason given as to why they waited so long. The FDLE report also makes no mention of the fact Sheena was found with only $7, when Genoese swore that he left her $100 to $150. Did someone steal the money, or is Genoese lying? The FDLE somehow forgets to mention that Detective Diaz itemized Sheena's things and only found 1 hotel room key in her belongings, but Genoese had signed for 2 keys to that room. Again, that document showing Genoese signing for 2 keys is available on archangelsofjustice.org under the podcast tab. Next, the FDLE report goes on to talk about January 5th and states that Detective Diaz interviewed Genoese and Dave Morris at the Bradenton Beach Police Department. Diaz reported that Genoese, quote, had the same story as the night we made the notification of Sheena's death. My question here is, what were the details of Genoese's story that didn't change? There's no report or recording of either of these, quote, interviews Detective Diaz conducted. Also, Detective Diaz considers the time when Genoese and Dave picked up Sheena's things an interview? They clearly didn't view Genoese as a suspect because they released Sheena's belongings to him. So why does the FDLE refer to this as an interview? We also have no idea when Detective Diaz told this to the FDLE. So these conversations could have been from Detective Diaz's memory 4 years after he closed the case. A case he thought was a suicide 5 minutes after he went into the room. This is the same Detective Diaz who never worked a murder before. I also want to talk about the glaring issue with the interviews Detective Diaz conducted, that the FDLE conveniently uses when it suits them, but forgets it when it doesn't. Because it'll play a role in how the FDLE reports their interactions with Sheena's family and friends. Florida law states that if 2 law enforcement officials are present, then an interview does not need to be taped. But if only 1 law enforcement official is conducting the interview, it must be taped. Well, neither of these criteria are met in Detective Diaz's case, so anything he heard would not be allowed in a court of law, and therefore should not be in the FDLE's report. But getting back to the FDLE report, which then talks about Detective Diaz's questions to Dave, Sheena's father from New York. I would like you to take notice at how detailed this interaction is from the FDLE report. Diaz questioned Dave Morris about the statement Sheena had reportedly made to Bradenton Beach police officers Basil and Security the morning of her death. The previously noted $100 bill, Sheena being a trust fund baby, Sheena receiving a dog when she was hospitalized for a seizure, her father living 3,000 miles away, and not speaking with her mother for 10 years. Dave reported that none of these statements were accurate, and Dave could not explain why Sheena said them to the officers. Detective Diaz noted that he spoke with Genoese, and at that time, quote, Dave did not have that many questions at all as to my investigation. Okay, again, a couple of things to unpack here. We already talked about Basil and Security, but why does it matter if Dave had questions to your investigation? Why is this statement even here? The FDLE report then jumps to January 22nd, 2009, and somehow forgets to mention anything about what happened in the weeks to follow. There is no mention of the second hotel key discovered by Sheena's family, the fact that Kelly was the one who discovered Sheena's 911 call, not the Bradenton Beach police, all the things Genoese did in the weeks following Sheena's death, or the fact that Kelly had to beg Detective Diaz to at least question Genoese about his whereabouts. This is covered in episode 2, if you'd like to go back and listen later. According to Detective Diaz's recollection, this is what Genoese told him on January 22nd. Sheena and himself went back to their room at the bridge walk after watching the fireworks. They argued after Genoese called his children to wish them a happy new year. He claimed that they would argue often about him calling his kids, and that Sheena was very selfish about their time together. Again, this is something I keep reading over and over from Genoese, that Sheena hated his children. Then Detective Diaz goes on about his talk with Genoese. Genoese claimed that Sheena would get, quote, very confrontational and would get right in his face yelling and screaming. He stated that Morris was, quote, so close to his face, she was spitting in his face. The argument resulted in them deciding to stay in the room for the remainder of the night. Later in the night, Sheena got out of bed and wanted to go back out. Genoese told her that it was too late. A second argument ensued, and Sheena began yelling and screaming at him. Genoese claimed that during the argument, Sheena grabbed, quote, all the money they had from her purse and started to run out of the room. Genoese grabbed her on the balcony and retrieved the money. They returned to the room and continued to argue. So here it is again, Genoese stating that this fight was not about his children, but about Sheena wanting to go back out. And did Genoese admit to assaulting and robbing Sheena? He clearly left marks on her body from this altercation, but there was no follow-up questions when Genoese gives this answer. Then Genoese goes on to tell Detective Diaz this. They decided to leave the resort and started packing their suitcases. When they were done packing, Sheena changed her mind and wanted to stay. Genoese stated that he was leaving with or without her, and did so shortly after. Genoese advised that he left Sheena approximately $100 to $150 and reported that Sheena accused him of taking $100 that belonged to her. Genoese then left the room. He noted that as he walked down the stairs, he observed 2 police cars parked beside each other in the parking lot of the resort. Genoese claimed that he maintained contact with Sheena via telephone and text as he drove home. Here we go again. There is nothing documented here that shows Detective Diaz asking about why Genoese didn't use his Sky Pass while driving that morning. I guess it is not suspicious to Detective Diaz that Genoese uses this express lane toll pass every time he drove before and after, but the night his fiancée is found dead and he physically assaulted her, he conveniently uses cash at every toll on the 1-hour drive to his home. Genoese has claimed in interviews that it was because he was distracted that he didn't use his Sky Pass. But both the FDLE and Bradenton Beach Police did not think this was strange at all. The FDLE report also makes no mention of the fact that Sheena was found with only $7, and there is no explanation as to where the rest of the money went. So either Genoese is lying or someone took the money. Sal talks about the answers Genoese gave to detectives.
He also said that he left her about $100 to $150, but when her purse was found in the room, there was only $7. So he's lying again. He told everybody he left her $100 to $150, and there's only $7 in the purse. Okay, so somebody's lying. Joe's lying, or the cops are lying. Somebody's lying.
I've already talked about the hotel key, which again, Genoese never officially answers how many keys were given to him when he checked in. The FDLE report finishes the interaction with this line again. Detective Diaz had spoken to Genoese on other occasions, and his story remained the same every other time. Which very well might be the case, but his story doesn't add up. And there's also no report of these, quote, other occasions, so that line is again meaningless. The FDLE report goes on to say that on January 27th, the medical examiner's report, suicide by hanging, was submitted to the Bradenton Beach Police and the state attorney's office. This is from the FDLE report. Bradenton Beach Police Detective Leonard Diaz reported that he closed the case after reviewing the evidence, interviewing Genoese and Osborne, and receiving the medical examiner's report, ruling Morris's death a suicide. He noted that the investigation did not reveal foul play was involved in the death. The report was approved on February 13, 2009. Here is where I don't understand why the FDLE didn't confront Detective Diaz about his lack of an investigation. He didn't know about Genoese signing for the 2 hotel keys. Kelly found that. He never looked at Genoese's cell phone or SkyPass records. He didn't even know about the 911 call Sheena made. Kelly again found that. And he didn't even officially interview Genoese. What exactly did Detective Diaz do other than show up at the hotel and declare Sheena's death a suicide? The FDLE puts in their report this for some unknown reason. Detective Diaz reported that approximately 2 months after Morris's death, Genoese responded to the Bradenton Beach Police, quote, unannounced. Diaz reported that Genoese was concerned about how Kelly Osborne was treating him. She suspected him of being involved in Morris's death. Diaz reported that Genoese cried during the meeting as he stated how much he loved Morris and claimed that he would never have done anything to hurt her. Diaz noted that Genoese, quote, appeared confused and still very upset about his fiance's death. Okay, Genoese responded to the Bradenton Beach Police? What does that mean? Did he show up at the police department or did he call? And who cares? What does this have to do with Sheena's death? This is a grieving mother 2 months after her daughter's death. Genoese physically assaulted her that night and was the last person to speak with her. And his answers to the questions don't make any sense. All this shows to me is Kelly was doing more work than the detective assigned to her daughter's case. I have Kelly and Dave talk about what they were doing in those 2 months following Sheena's death, and how this shows a pattern of Genoese going to other people to solve his problem.
I wasn't doing anything. I was investigating her death, and I was speaking with people who he dated, ex-business partners, doing what the FDLE and the Bradenton Beach Police Department were supposed to be doing that weren't. I was out doing their job for them.
That's what he did with me. He came to me to argue or to complain about Sheena. So obviously now he's going to Detective Diaz to complain about Kelly or I or both of us.
Okay, so Genoese is so distraught 2 months later, right? But just a month later, Mr. Distraught Genoese is off to New Orleans with an ex-girlfriend. He's not so distraught, is he? And then another girl that I spoke with that was dating Joe, and they went to Miami right after Sheena's death. The girl herself had lost a very good friend, and she was still grieving over her friend's loss. So she had asked Genoese while they were riding back in the car, why do you not seem to be upset about losing your girlfriend, your fiance? And his response to her was, she was nothing but a pill-popping alcoholic.
Next, the FDLE talks about Daniel Grossi. I have Kelly explain who he is.
Dan Grossi was a private investigator that we had hired and we didn't really know what we were hiring him to do. This was our first time ever dealing with something like this. So I had asked him to go to the police departments and look into personnel files on the two officers. And part of the reason for this, I need to explain, is that so at the time there's no polygraph, there's nothing done. So to be an effective investigator, I need to look at everything. And that was to not rule Genoese as the person who did it or to rule him out. I had to look at everything. So when I look at the police reports and I see all the discrepancies, and I see that this Detective Basil has a not so stellar history in law enforcement, I have to look at everything. And so I was hoping that Dan could find for me what it was whatever it was that could have been in these personnel files, because I'm looking at everything. The police that were in that room last night, if something happened there, because, they could have easily gone back to that room as well.
This is what the FDLE reported about that meeting, and notice the language that is used in this part of the report. In March 2009, Bradenton Beach Police Detective Leonard Diaz met with private investigator Daniel Grossi at the Bradenton Beach Police Department. Grossi informed Diaz that he was reviewing the personnel files of Bradenton Beach police officers Tuskeri and Basil as a favor to Kelly Osborne, and they had not seen anything in the files or in the report that looked suspicious. Grossi stated that he, Diaz, was dealing with a grieving mother that was in denial. Diaz noted that Grossi was, quote, stunned to learn that Kelly had reported that Morris had been diagnosed as bipolar, and claimed that Kelly was just, quote, listening to all of her friends who thought Sheena could not have committed suicide. Grossi advised that the family would want to meet with Detective Diaz one last time for, quote, final closure. I have Kelly talk about this statement.
When I had asked Diaz some years later for his complete report, I never saw that, so that must have been recreated for the FDLE sometime later, way later, or after it was reopened, because that didn't exist before that.
Unless it was held back from us.
He, in an email, assured me that we had everything. So I remember when the FDLE report and everything was closed and we got everything, I sent Dan Grossi what the FDLE wrote in their report about what he said. And he told me that it was a lie and that was not what he said.
Next, the FDLE report goes on to say this. On April 7, 2009, Bradenton Beach Police Detective interviewed Genoese via telephone at the request of Grossi and Kelly Osborne. He reported that he questioned Genoese about his route home from the bridge walk on January 1st, a second hotel room key reportedly found at the Osborne residence, that the family believed Genoese had kept, allowing him to re-enter the room upon his return, his luggage, and his knowledge of the Manatee County Sheriff's Office website. Diaz reported that Genoese's responses were consistent with the information he had previously given. Genoese had returned home via the Skyway, but could not recall if he used his SunPass to pay the toll. He denied having the second hotel key and claimed that the other members of Sheena's family were going through her belongings on January 5th, and one of them could have placed the key on the counter. Genoese had purchased the suitcase in Bradenton Beach and had taken it with him upon his departure from the bridge walk on January 1st, 2009. He learned about the Manatee County Sheriff's Office website concerning the dispatch calls via the recording on the main office line. Genoese denied returning to the bridge walk on January 1st, 2009. There it is, finally. Over 3 months after Sheena's death, Detective Diaz documents asking Genoese about the second hotel room key and the SkyPass issue. But of course, there is no follow-up or actual explanation given by Genoese. Remember, Detective Diaz itemized Sheena's belongings and only saw one key. So how would Sheena's family have gotten the other key? We know for a fact there were 2 keys, so Genoese denying having the other one means he's lying. How is this answer okay for an FDLE investigation? Why aren't they pushing for more answers? I talked to Kelly about what she thought of the FDLE report up to this point.
I feel like now and today is that everything that they were asking me questions about, because I didn't know how she died. I didn't get the truth as to how she was actually found. They did, and they quickly surmised to suicide. So therefore, their series of questions to me were all about suicide. And so when they're asking me questions, I'm assuming, that I'm assuming that I'm trying to straighten the record, that it was if they're asking me if she had attempted suicide before, that I'm trying to explain that, it was a fake attempt. It was just and so they go ahead and they take that as though I said she attempted suicide before.
Next, the FDLE goes on to talk about this. On August 17, 2009, Detective Diaz interviewed Marcus Claudio via telephone at the request of Kelly Osborne. Diaz reported that Claudio stated that he saw Genoese at his Indian Rocks Beach residence between 2:30 a.m. and 3 a.m. on the morning of January 1st, 2009. Claudio reported that Genoese was, quote, very upset and advised that he and Sheena had gotten into an argument. Genoese told Claudio that he was going to stay at the house. So according to this report, Detective Diaz cleared Genoese without even checking on his alibi. And he didn't even check it till August 17th, 2009. I talked to Sal and Ira about what they found out about Marcus Claudio.
Your tracks again. Is there a taped statement of Marco Claudio?
No.
Is there a written statement made by him? No. It's again a report generated by the police that says he said this or she said that. And that means nothing. But it's just to the family, it says, look, we interviewed them. They came up with nothing, or they told us this or that. And they expect the family to bite this and eat it and take it. And that's what they do. They're going to do some half-ass investigation, because every time you use the word investigation in this, I want to throw up. Because it's not an investigation. This is an assassination of Sheena Morris's character and her family. And it's sad because they didn't investigate a damn thing in this case, not properly. What they did was cover up for the screw up from the first night of the domestic to the death, because they knew Braden Beach's ass was in a ringer if they proved that this man killed her or somebody else did. Fact of the matter was, they damn didn't want to take a chance on proving a murder done by Genoese, because that would have left them in a bad situation, because they screwed this thing up from the beginning.
The FDLE report talks about Detective Diaz finally getting Genoese's cell phone records. In October 2009, at the request of Kelly Osborne, via the Hill Ward Henderson law firm in Tampa, Detective Diaz subpoenaed Genoese's cellular telephone records for January 1st, 2009. The specific request, noted in the July 29, 2009 letter from Hill Ward Henderson, was for the Bradenton Beach Police to subpoena, quote, Mr. Genoese's cell phone carrier to determine the cell phone tower locations for the calls after he left the motel and his text message between 2:28 a.m. and 2:55 a.m. on January 1st, 2009, to help determine if Mr. Genoese did leave the area and go to his home in Indian Rocks Beach. If you remember, this is the report that Detective Diaz could not figure out how to file the first time and had to ask for help. There is also a little nugget of information that the FDLE fails to mention. Detective Diaz states in the subpoena that one of the hotel guests heard an alarm go off at 5 a.m. and it was immediately shut off. You can find this subpoena on the archangelsofjustice.org website. My question to the FDLE and to Detective Diaz is why this was not done the days after Sheena's death, and why Kelly was the one to have to make it happen. This is what the FDLE said about that report on the cell phone records. The cellular records revealed that Genoese had returned to Pinellas County via the Skyway Bridge and maintained contact with Sheena via telephone as he traveled north on Interstate 275. The records indicate that Genoese's cell phone began communicating with the towers in Pinellas County at 2:13 a.m. and continued communicating with the towers as he traveled north. A call made by Genoese at 9:33 a.m. later that morning was communicating with the tower in Indian Rocks Beach. These statements are patently false and not supported by the hard evidence. Genoese was actually pinged at 2:13 by a tower in Indian Rocks Beach, then at 2:21 a.m. by a tower in St. Petersburg. That 9:33 ping was in South Tampa. Kelly again talks about the FDLE and Detective Diaz both being able to correctly read the ping report.
Yes, the FDLE was trying to just simply show that Genoese had gone home like he said. So they manipulated fraudulently manipulated those reports. After the case was closed and we questioned as to how they manipulated those reports, they sent back a brief email basically stating that it was a mistake and it doesn't change the outcome of anything.
The statements and the reports for these two independent experts is available on archangelsofjustice.org. That is where I'm going to leave off for this week. Next week, I'm going to talk about the rest of the FDLE report and how, instead of looking at the hard evidence from the night in question, they go on to character assassinate Sheena, Kelly, and Dave, but portray Genoese as an honest man who had a crazy fiance. A special thanks to Mike Mack, who did all the music for this podcast. If you'd like to hear more samples of Mike Mack's work, you can go to his website, www.mike-mack.com, or you can follow him on Twitter @MikeMack. Thank you to our sponsors, Blueberry and TotalFrontPage.com. Please support them as they have supported this podcast from the very beginning. If you're interested in learning more about this case, you will soon find all the evidence and documentation used in this podcast at archangelsofjustice.org/podcast. For updates about future episodes and cases, follow us on Twitter @ArchangelPod and on Facebook under Archangels of Justice. If you would like to send us an email, you can reach us at podcast@archangelsofjustice.org. If you are listening on iTunes or SoundCloud, we would appreciate it if you left us a positive review. Thank you for listening, and I hope you will join us next week for part 2 of the FDLE's investigation and episode 6 of the Sheena Morris case.